Welcome back to State of the Nation. On the 12th of February of this year, at exactly this time, GB News hosted an episode of the People's Forum with the Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury, Rishi Sunak, presented by our own Stephen Dixon. Because GB News is the People's Channel, GB News created a new broadcasting format that put the people at the centre of the programme, with questions coming from members of the public and not from journalists. GB News hired an external and independent organisation to select the audience, which consisted of roughly 100 undecided voters. Neither GB News nor the Prime Minister knew what the questions were in advance. The programme's format gave complete freedom to the people to ask their questions. But apparently, the broadcast regulator, Ofcom, doesn't believe in putting voters at the heart of government scrutiny. Today, Ofcom released its decision that found GB News to be in breach of the Broadcasting Code and is now considering sanctioning GB News. Ofcom has made three basic claims for its decisions: that a wide range of views were not presented, that due impartiality was not preserved, and that there was a problem with the Prime Minister promoting policies in a period preceding a UK general election. To the first 2 points of a wide range of views not being heard and a lack of due impartiality, I can give you evidence here and now to debunk these points. Here's an example.
Robin White, I'm a barrister from Somerset. Why should LGBT people vote Conservative?
We've made changes in the NHS for provision of healthcare services for same-sex couples, and that gives, hopefully, you and everyone else a sense that look, this is a country whose values are reflected in our party and in government, and that is that it's a compassionate, tolerant place.
Forgive me slightly, but I think some of the issue may be less about the LGB and more about the T, Prime Minister. More about the trans issue.
Quite clearly, this was a left-wing criticism of government's stance on LGBT matters, and the presenter, Stephen Dixon, pushed it on the Prime Minister further. It was a clear occasion of a question being asked, an answer being given, and then pushed back onto the Prime Minister. He was also held to account on a range of other policies. Listen to this on Rwanda.
Why are you so adamant about Rwanda when public documentation shows it isn't working and that it's not going to work? So can you be open and honest with everybody today and tell us what the next steps are?
For the first time since the small boats thing became a phenomenon, the numbers were down. They weren't down by a little, they were down by over a third. That if you come to our country illegally, you won't get to stay. We want to be able to remove you, either to your home country if it's safe, like we've done with Albania, and for everyone else we need an alternative, and that's what Rwanda is about.
Prime Minister, I'm not meant to really interject with any questions, but I've got to say a lot of people will be wondering, how do you get this through Parliament? This is a big problem.
And here we had a questioner saying to the Prime Minister he wasn't being open and honest. If that's not challenge, I don't know what is. And here's another example on the question of social care.
Social care is chronically underfunded, and government has abdicated responsibility to local government, effectively making it a postcode lottery for many. Do you agree that it needs radical reform? And if so, what?
We announced an extra £600 million for local government across the country. And of that extra money that we've put in, the bulk of it is ring-fenced specifically for social care.
It's such a difficult issue which has faced so many governments, but do we ever seem to get an answer where we can really see any significant difference within a short timescale at least?
In each of these three instances, the questions challenged the Prime Minister, and Stephen Dixon interjected to further the challenge. And you must think Ofcom is like the deaf adder that charmed GB News ever so nicely. It stuffeth up its ears. But to address the bizarre claim about the Prime Minister promoting policies in a period preceding a UK general election, every point in English and then British history since the middle of the 13th century precedes a UK general election. And since the Fixed-Term Parliament Act was abolished, inevitably, you're always in a pre-election period. And that's been our normal state of affairs for hundreds of years. If the programme had been hosted 2 years ago or 3 years ago, it would still have been preceding a UK general election. And there's nothing in the broadcast code that says anything about preceding a UK general election other than when Parliament's been dissolved and we are in an official election period, which we were not during the programme and still are not now. We're not even in the Electoral Commission's pre-general election early spending period, which starts in July. So this decision is quite sinister. GB News was and has continued to be completely transparent about this broadcast structure that stays true to its values. But Ofcom seemingly only wants apparatchiks to ask the questions. This chilling decision gets to the heart of what the media ought to be. For decades, journalists seem to be on the side of the elite against the people, that they know what is best. But at GB News, we believe the people know what is best. Ofcom begs to differ. So GB News is the newest addition to the broadcast ecosystem, and it's doing quite well. This programme has reasonable figures, and most days we're a bit ahead of Sky, and sometimes ahead of the BBC too. The establishment doesn't like this. You could forget the time not too long ago when a journalist called for GB News to be taken off air on BBC Newsnight and went entirely unchallenged. There were Ofcom complaints about this, but we didn't hear anything about threats or sanctions.
You know, I have to say, I think the complaints have piled up against GB News. I think there is a delicate and important broadcast ecology in this country. I think, you know, GB News is trying to bust that ecology, and frankly, what Ofcom should do is shut it down, like it shut down RT.
Speaking of the so-called delicate broadcast ecology that ought not to be disrupted, it's about time it said that you, the public, own a broadcaster that poses as impartial news, but in reality pumps out left-wing propaganda. And for once, I'm not talking about Auntie, the BBC, which has its own problems. I'm referring to Channel 4 News. Hardly surprised that people like Adam Bolton, who it must be said has some degree of interest to declare, along with other establishment journalists, they would like us shut down. But for Ofcom to behave like this represents a threat to freedom of speech. It's about time its antiquated, nonsensical regulations were removed for privately funded broadcasters, not least because it can't seem to apply them fairly. It is a dark day for freedom of expression. It's time we had an equivalent to the United States First Amendment that protects freedom of speech from left-wing bureaucrats. I'd like to make it clear that both GB News and I wholeheartedly reject this ruling and will not back down on our foundational principle, whether Ofcom likes it or not. We are here to represent you, the British people. GB News is in a way an easy target for the left, but we're not going anywhere. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com.